Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Anthony Kimani Kibingo AA Wash Processed Kenya from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York, and they're one of our most featured American coffee roasters on this channel, and that is largely because they release so many coffees throughout the year that it's just a matter of time before they release something that does catch our interest. And while we were originally interested in this coffee, there was another Kenyan coffee that they released that same week, that one being the Gerald and Njagi coffee. And our original plan was to purchase and review both of them. However, by the time that we were able to communicate with Airworks about splitting each of those boxes, the other coffee had been sold out, so we had to settle on just purchasing this coffee. Now that Gerald and Njagi coffee caught my interest because it was a pure SL28 coffee. However, Say heavily marketed this one as they said that it was one of the best Kenyan coffees that they had had in years. So for that reason, I was still interested in purchasing it. So we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So a lot has been made about Say's recent change as to the person that is roasting their coffees, as a lot of people might either know or are just finding out that they did change roasters relatively recently. Since the last time we actually reviewed one of their coffees, there's been that transition. So as a result, this one is roasted by Lance, who is one of the co-owners of Say, and a lot of people made a big fuss about the change in the profile of the coffee, and I can say that this one did feel a little lighter than some of the coffees that we have reviewed from them in the recent past. So I do have to say it's not quite as light as the experiences that we had from them several years ago, which were very, very light. So for that reason, I will still say that this one skews on the more moderately light side of things. It's still lighter relative to the majority of American-based coffee roasters, but for context, we mentioned in our recent blind taste test rankings video that we noticed just how much of a difference there was from something like H&S's Ultralight versus the other Kenyan coffee, that Gerald Njagi coffee, that we were also featuring in that blind taste test. So that's to say, definitely not quite as light as something like that, but still on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, so we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was a little bit more tomato than expected, and it's present in the aroma early in the coffee itself. It does cool down a little bit better with some of the listed plum qualities, but otherwise it's pretty Kenyan-like with an abundance of the tart red berry qualities to it, so it was a mixed first impression, and having this coffee be as tomato forward as it was a little perplexing, but I was going to see if that would be a continuous trend, as on day 18 we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was a little better today as there was a little less of the savory tomato qualities to it with better sweetness, but it didn't cool off particularly well, as there are plenty of these savory qualities as it did cool down. Possibly best to, possibly still a bit more to work with on this one, so just okay again. First two impressions having more of those savory tomato qualities to it was interesting to me. The first question I asked myself is, one of the main reasons they suggested this coffee because they really seem to like the tomato-like qualities, because I know a lot of people really adore that characteristic of a Kenyan coffee, so if that's why this coffee has been as hyped as it is, then I'm the wrong person for it, but we'll see if that continues, as on day 24 we opted for the UFO brewer, and it's still not that different in comparison to some of the earlier days, as it's pretty red forward in terms of the fruit and floral qualities to it, with a fair bit of tomato. Been pretty direct. I don't see anything that differentiates it too much from the majority of other Kenyan coffees that we've reviewed as of this moment, so haven't really enjoyed the coffee as of this moment yet. We'll go ahead and move on to day 28 as we opted for the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so 17:1 and 99 degrees Celsius. And there are more struggles as the coffee continues to yield a wild tomato-like aroma. So it's one thing if it's just present in the cup itself, but it's an entirely different thing when it's just so abundant in the actual aroma of the coffee itself. It really hasn't changed much since the initial impression, as there's just a little bit more sweetness when we push it, but outside of that, it's been a bit more tomato forward than I would necessarily like. Day 31 to the Chemex with the same adjustments, and The coffee was by far the best it had been to this point, as it's starting to offer a glimmer of potential with a sweeter and cleaner experience, off brew offering a bit more of a stone fruit in line with the listed plum. So this time around, I'm starting to see it. I was feeling maybe there is a direction that we can take this coffee, as there's still a bit of tomato, but notably less so, and it's much better in the finish. So a lot of positives to take away on this day, and it's going to be interesting to see if we could replicate that going forward, as on day 34 we decided to go back down to our standard recipe, and it has improved overall, offering significantly less of the tomato-like qualities. So I do have to say, from my experience, the day 31 point going forward, that's when you started to get less of the tomato, and the coffee did seem to open up with some additional depth to it. Better presentation of these stone fruit qualities, as it feels like it was better when we pushed on the Chemex, so it felt like we might go back to it. But on day 38, we decided to go back to the Chemex with our standard recipe yet again. And it just seemed better in this brew method on this day, as well, as it feels like the coffee is just naturally improved with time. And that's been the sentiment with this coffee, is that day 31 mark going forward, it just seemed to flip a switch. And that definitely helped, given that I was really struggling with this coffee early on. Cleaner traces of the stone fruits, but I think I still liked that day 34 V60 day a little bit more than the Chemex day. So on day 42, we opted to go back with the V60. And it was actually one of the better days of this coffee, offering an abundance of the Kenyan-like qualities to it in the darker tart berry scents and red florality. Interestingly enough, the red floral they had listed on here was rose as opposed to hibiscus. I can see it, a little bit more of that kind of rose hip characteristic. But outside of that, there's depth with the listed plum in a surprisingly abundant sense, with traces of some slightly tart apples, passion fruit, and even pineapple grapefruit. So day 42, really nice day, a lot of lovely depth. This is a very fruit-forward experience for this Kenyan coffee, and I was kind of surprised that we got to this point, given that the early days were just so savory and tomato-forward that I did not think that we'd ever get to this level of fruit-forward qualities. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those. We will start with the cleanliness level 4. And it's actually a big deal when it comes to Kenyan coffees, because on the early days, it's that level 3. The tomato was just so abundant, and if there's a heavy tomato quality to a coffee, especially a Kenyan coffee, then it's going to be hard for it to score the level 4. But towards the end, there's just really lovely definition to all the fruit characteristics, and honestly, one of the better defined Kenyan coffees we've had this year. So level 4, where we opted to put that. We'll go ahead and move on to the finish and acidity level 4. I like to discuss those two things together when it comes to Kenyan coffees. But for me, on the early days, it was plenty bright, but the finish was a little bit more savory, a very long-lasting tomato feel to it. But towards the end of this coffee, we got a lot more of the fruit characteristics to it within the finish as well. So I do have to say the finish was actually one of the better parts of this coffee towards the later days. Sweetness level 4, very sweet, fruit sweet, and that was kind of surprising, given the early days was pretty generic Kenyan, bright, tart, red berries, and savory tomato qualities. But towards the end, just a lot more of a rich, sweeter fruit quality to it. Florality level 4, I do believe I'd already mentioned they had that rose note list on here. I don't see the florality as being particularly unique when it comes to Kenyan coffees overall. The unique part for me was the fruit depth that it did offer. So I can see the rose, but for me, it's still a little bit closer to that rose hip hibiscus characteristic that is pretty synonymous with Kenyan coffees. Berry fruit level 4, definitely still an abundance of those tart berry qualities to it. I do believe that they had one of those listed on here, something maybe along the lines of a blackberry or some sort of currant, but they, I know for sure, had some berry quality, and I can definitely see that. Definitely a little bit of tartness to it in that regard. Stone fruit level 4, I do recall that plum note, because that's the one that seemed to shine through the most for me, especially on the later days, and I really appreciated that, given the just very well-defined nature of that characteristic within this coffee, offering it some additional depth. So level 4, where we opted to put that. 2 level 3s, we will breeze through those real quick, starting with the citrus level 3. I mentioned an abundance of citric characteristics. They're a little bit more subtle, not as intense as the stone fruit or the berry quality to it, but notes I mentioned was something like the slightly tart apples, a little bit of a passion fruit, pineapple, grapefruit, so an abundance of them, just maybe not quite as intense. And then the final thing worth discussing, body level 3, there is certainly plenty of texture to it. I feel like a broken record when it comes to Kenyan coffees, as we've reviewed quite a few of them, and I think this is the last Kenyan coffee, yeah, of the bunch that we're reviewing for a bit, and it also has that level 3. They just seem pretty consistent in that regard. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Having had an opportunity to try the Gerald and Joggy coffee a number of times now, since we got about 100 grams of it, but not enough to do a full review or as much of a full review as I would have liked, I can say that I definitely preferred the way that this coffee did end up when compared alongside that coffee. And as mentioned, I was probably a little bit more interested in that coffee given it was a pure SL28 coffee, but they sold this coffee pretty hard, and I can see why towards the end. On the early days, I did not like this coffee whatsoever, but halfway through it, exactly halfway through it, the coffee switched, it changed, it got significantly better, and I see why they were selling this coffee so high. Now, I'm not going to say it's on par with some of the very best Kenyan coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. I still think you have the Kianjege from Manhattan a couple of years ago, and even the Bature Gesha that we had, the Kenyan Gesha last year, which was phenomenal. But this one right here is pretty good. I would definitely say on the better end of things when it comes to a lot of the Kenyan coffees that we've reviewed this year. So I see why there's the hype. I just wish that maybe this coffee would have been that way right from the start, because if this coffee was as fruit forward as it was towards the end that it was at the start, then I can safely say that this would have been one of my favorite Kenyan coffees this year. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Tricky because it's not particularly traditional Kenyan-like, though it does offer plenty of those qualities to it. So we'll start with that. Still very bright, still plenty of those red fruit, red floral qualities to it, but also plenty of depth to it, especially in the stone fruit-like scents, which is always a selling point to me, whether it be peach or plums. I really appreciate that quality characteristic about a coffee, and this one did seem to offer a fair bit more of it than the average Kenyan coffee, coupled with a bit of depth in the citric sense, and that gives you a little bit more unique and complex of a Kenyan-like experience. That's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Anthony Kimani Kibingo AA Wash Processed Kenya from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.